Here's the design for January 2021. It's called Winter Friends, and I wanted to just kind of go over from the very beginning how I go about putting my pattern onto my fabric. If you've already seen this, feel free to skip ahead. You have to print your pattern out. So what I do is I print it out on the paper side of a piece of freezer paper. Freezer paper is the paper that has the wax on the back. I do have packs of 10 on my website that are cut to 8.5 by 11. They fit right through your printer, inkjet printer. So it's really simple. Instead of just printing it on paper, you print it on the freezer paper, on the paper side. And then what I do is I cut out, you don't need to, but my fabric piece was a little smaller, so I went ahead and just cut it out. So now I have this wax side I'm going to put against my fabric, and you want it on the back of your fabric. This is linen, which doesn't have a front or back, so it doesn't really matter. Now I'm going to iron this in place using a dry hot iron. And you just want to go over it. Wax is melted and stuck on there really well. And even if you don't want to trace it this way, this is a great way to use colored pencils too, to just iron a piece of freezer paper on the back of your fabric, and it makes it much easier to color on. Now the design and the fabric are stuck together, and it will be really easy to put it on my light box and trace it. So I have a light box that I love and I use it all the time, but it is kind of expensive, and whenever anybody's asked me about a light box, I realize you guys might not be using it as much as I do, and you might not need to invest in a really expensive one. So I found this one on Amazon. I wanted to give it a shot. It's really thin. You just plug it in, you just place your drawing on top of it, and you can see right through to trace. And this little light box was only like $15, I think. So I'll put the information about this light box on the end of the video, or in my description maybe. And then to trace, I like to use a Pilot friction pen. That's these guys, and I do have them on my website also. I guess the info is in the cap there. They disappear with the heat of an iron, which is kind of nice. So if you make a mistake or your stitches don't cover the lines perfectly, it doesn't matter because they will disappear with the heat of an iron. So I can just, I kind of do a little sketchy line, but you don't need to. Like that. I'll turn my lamp back on, turn this off. So you can see it makes a nice dark mark. But if I didn't want that mark to be there, I think my iron's still hot, the mark just goes away. So I'll trace this, and then the next step will be coloring. Now I've traced my design using the friction pen, and I'm ready to color it in. One thing I wanted to point out, when you use the freezer paper, see how this is in the right direction? When you flip it over, it's going to be in the opposite direction. Usually my designs, it really doesn't matter which way they're going, right or left. But if it is something directional, you'll want to keep that in mind. Okay, so I'm going to color this in. I'm going to use a Prismacolor. I think most colored pencils would work, good quality ones, probably not kids ones. This is the slate gray. And the first thing I'm going to do is kind of go around the sky and the snowman. So I like to have a point, but not a sharp point. I like it to be kind of flat on one side, if that makes sense. So I might even kind of wear it down a little bit. So where I have a nice flat spot that comes to a nice point. And then I can just start very gently. And that's kind of the trick. You want to just go gentle and then work your way to more and more layers to get your dark areas. So just like that, pretty easy. Now I'm going to make this a little bit darker, I think. One thing you do have to do before you start stitching is you have to fix or set this color, because if you don't, it's just going to rub off on your hands while you're stitching and there won't be anything left on there. and your hard work will be for naught. So what I recommend doing is when it's all done, before you pull the freezer paper off, and you see how this freezer paper is making it really simple to draw on, you're gonna fix it. I like to use this. It's Jacquard Textile 100 Colorless Extender. And I use a small brush with fairly stiff bristles, not too stiff. And sometimes I even water it down just a tiny bit, but that will fix it. You can wash these with soap and the color's not going to come out. You don't need a lot, but you do need to make sure that it is absorbed into the colors. Now, I will say with some color pencils, and this one is included in that, it will change the color a little bit. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for just a second because I want to show you, I did get a little bit farther on another one. So this is using the same color pencil, but with the extender, it really brightened it up. So if you're not sure before you start, go ahead and just do a little sample and see if that colorless extender changes the color in a way that you like or not. So mostly for the background, I just did a pretty solid dark color. And then in the foreground, I did just little bits and bobs to show where the snow was. Now for the head and for the body, I wanted to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. So I'll just start on the head here so you can see. I'm not going to color the whole thing. I'm just kind of doing one side because we're going to pretend like the bright light of the moon is shining down here. So the shadow's on this side. And we want to just work it out where you're just barely touching. You don't want it to be really heavy. And then you can go back in and you can add a little more pressure. But I guess when you brush it with your brush, you can move the pigment around a little bit. So less, I think, is more. So that's probably all you'd need right there to make his head look a little more three-dimensional. You could even go in a little darker if you want, but I would keep it way on the edge, like that. I used was a DMC floss on this for the blue, and then just an ecru for the snowflakes. So I'll go ahead and start stitching what's left of this, and I'll show you how to do these different stitches. This is my stitchery without the color pencils, and this is just on a nice cotton fabric. It's a motif fabric, and I'm just using one color of floss again. This time it's the Valdani tealish blue, which is very similar. This one's a little more gray, the DMC. It's a really, I think this one's a really pretty wintry kind of color. So this is what it looks like just stitched up without any coloring. And this is the one that we were working on, that we've done some coloring. It's fixed. I went ahead and started some of the embroidery, and now I'll go over some of the stitches with you. So with a Valdani thread, I just use the 12 weight and the pearl cotton. I just pull it right off of the ball. I don't need to do anything. But with DMC, I do only use 2 strands, so it would be necessary to divide those strands. So I'm going to cut a length. And what I like to do is kind of tap on the end, and it separates the strands, and then I can just easily pull one out. And it's easier to pull one out at a time rather than 2. And this also helps with keeping the thread from twisting so much while you're stitching. It takes some of that twist out. I like to use a size 7 embroidery needle. I'm not too particular, but I use the ones that I have on my website that I like. And they come with a little sample stitch. There's like 12 different ones. I hand make the little magnetic, it's kind of like a matchbook that holds the needles, and each one has a different stitch demonstrated on the back. So we'll start with the basic stem stitch. We'll start at the base of his coat. Well, actually, I'm looking at this. I always try to think of where's the beginning, and then I can just kind of do it all in one fell swoop, and that looks like it goes all the way around. So I could start here. So I'm going to pull my needle up right in the beginning, or corner, the edge, and I'm always going to carry my thread on the same side. So either up or down, but I'm not going to alternate. And I'm going to take 1/8 of an inch and come back halfway to where I began. Pull the needle up, and that's my first stitch. Now my second stitch, I'm going to go 1/8 of an inch, and I'm going to come back in the same hole that last stitch ended. And I think the real trick into getting a stem stitch to lay nice and flat and is to keep the stitches pretty short. I do tend to go a little bit longer if I'm if I'm just like on a big straight line, but it's best actually to keep them uniform. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I like to go around corners. Since I have to go around a few corners, I'll show you a couple of different ways that I do it. Okay, so I've reached the corner. I probably should have used a thread where you could see it against the coloring. Sorry if it's difficult to see. But I'm going to put my needle down right in the corner. I'm going to come up 1/8 of an inch away up on the other side. Then I'm going to go back down in that same hole in the corner and come up halfway in between, kind of like when we started down here. And I'm going to keep the thread on the outside there. And now I'm already turned the corner and I can just start stitching. Now since this has a curve in it, I do want to carry my thread on the outside. It helps the thread from kind of falling in when you're going around a curve. So that is the basic stem stitch. I'll do a little more stitching and then I'll show you some other ways to turn a corner. Now I've reached this corner, I'm going to turn it. It's not quite as sharp as this other corner. So another way that I like to do it is to put my needle down right in the corner and then flip my project over, thread my needle through that last stitch. Now that thread is anchored and I can come up right in that corner again and just start stitching this direction. Now since this curve is towards me, I'm going to carry the thread toward me. Now I've come to another corner right there. So this time I'm just going to skip around the corner, go about 1/8 of an inch, come back up right in the corner, and I'm going to have my thread underneath my needle. Now keep in mind, purists would be cringing if they saw this. I like to just kind of make it up as I go along. And these are just the things I like to do. You don't have to do them this way. Now I just tack it like you would a fly stitch. And I'm going to come up halfway in between that stitch that went around the corner there, and then just continue on until I come to the next corner. So those are basically the 3 different ways that I turn a corner. But like I said, do what's comfortable for you, and if you want to enter it in a contest like at a state fair or something, then I would definitely do it the first way. I believe that is the correct way to do it. Here's another thing that happens occasionally. If you're doing a long piece, you're going to run out of thread. And if you run out of thread in the middle of a line, like this one I could probably take to the corner, but just for purposes of showing you, I'm going to go ahead and pretend that that's as far as I could go. So I'm going to put my needle in just like I would if I was taking a stitch, about 1/8 of an inch. Take it to the back. Now I'm going to thread my end under. You can do this or tie a knot, but I recommend threading it under because you're going to have some bulk there otherwise, because we're going to need to tie a knot for the next strand to start. Now what I want to make sure I do is come up halfway in between. See where this is where the previous stitch ended, right there. And that's where I want to bring my needle up. Sometimes it's easier to bring it up on the wrong side because the thread has kind of fallen in a little bit. But now if I start here, my thread's going to be on the wrong side because I was carrying the thread out and this would be in. So I'm going to thread my needle under that last stitch so that I'm on the correct side of that. And then I can continue on. There's another corner. This one I'm just going to thread underneath. Come back. And as you can tell, I'm not using a hoop. I generally don't unless I'm doing something like a stem or a satin stitch or a basket weave stitch, sometimes fishbone stitch, things that require the fabric to be kind of taut, because if you pulled your thread too much, it could gather the fabric, which you don't want to do. I'm going to skip over here to the end of his scarf. Now on the pattern, you can see this is the little guy with the little wavy coat. There's a little fringe on the bottom. That kind of got covered up when I did my coloring. So I'm just going to do impromptu stitching. And since it's a scarf fringe, it really doesn't matter. And these are just single little stitches. Your scarf should be white. It's not going to show, is it? I learn things as I go. There we go. So that's how you do the fringe. Just little individual stitches. Sticking with the stem stitch, we're going to do this wavy line. And you know how I said you want to carry your thread on the same side as the curve? So in this case, I'm keeping it on that side. But then when I get down here, the curve's going this direction. So I know this probably is not what you're supposed to do, but I tend to switch my thread over. So I'm going the other side to follow that curve. As I said, a purist would cringe at this. And I'm going to flip it back up. But you know what I always try to think too is if stitching looks perfect, then it looks like a machine did it or could have done it. I like to have my work look like it was made by hands, not a machine, which mine definitely do look like they're made by hands. Okay, so we're almost done with that little stem stitch line. And let's just skip over, since we're right here, to these dots. These dots are French knots. So I'm going to wrap my head thread 3 times. So what you do is you pull your needle up on the dot. I missed it by a tick, but that's okay. And you're going to wrap it around 3 times. Kind of slide it so that you can pinch it. You don't want it to come off of the needle, but you don't want to keep it really tight. Now put the tip of your needle really close to where you came up. Now you can let go of that thread. Pull the end to pull the wraps down so they're touching the fabric. Pinch this front and back of the fabric. You don't want to pull it too tight because you have to pull your needle through. And that is a French knot. I'll do another one here. 1, 2, 3. Kind of hold it with my finger there. Put the tip down. Pull the thread strands down to the fabric. Pinch it and pull it through. Okay, this time I'm going to show you colonial knot, which I wouldn't recommend switching back and forth in the same project, but just so you can have a choice of what you want to do. You're going to have your needle and your thread parallel to each other, just side by side. You're going to cross the needle over the thread, take the tip under and wrap it under. Then put your finger on it so it doesn't go anywhere. And then take this end that you'd been holding on to and wrap it around your thread the other direction. So now on your needle, you have almost like a little tiny figure 8. Put the needle down in the fabric, Same thing, you pull those wraps down to the fabric, pinch that thread, pull the needle through, and that is another French knot. Or actually, excuse me, colonial knot. Try that again. Parallel, over the top, down and under, and then over the top. Take the needle down, pull the wraps to the fabric, pinch that thread, and pull it through. One thing I wanted to point out is when you get down to the last 2 strands and your 6 strands of floss, I still like to separate those 2 strands, and it just helps when you're stitching so that they don't twist up. And to thread a needle, if I had my magnifying glass, I could pretend like I'm 20 and it's super easy. If not, I pinch it between my fingers, press the eye down over where they are, and it just kind of push it through. To tie a knot, I'm going to place my needle and thread, make 1 loop, and pinch the end on the needle, wrap it around a couple of times, pinch those wraps with my finger, pull it through, keep pinching, and you end up with a little knot on the end. Okay, another super simple stitch is the running stitch. So when you're tracing your designs, if you're using, like this is the Pilot friction pen, which disappears with the heat of an iron. So if you're using something like that or a water-soluble pen, you can go ahead and instead of tracing each little stitch, you can just do 1 line and just use it as a guide. So a running stitch is just up, down, up, down, up. Nothing too crazy. And there you have it. We'll finish this coat. The 2 little buttons on the snowman are satin stitched along with the little balls on the ends of their hats. So these are tiny satin stitch areas, very, very small. They're only going to require a few stitches. So we're going to take a fairly small stitch, come up right next to it, make it a little bit longer, following the line of the button. And you just bring them really close to each other so they're touching like that. And then the last stitch will be a little bit shorter, so it will make it look a little bit more round. That's the little satin stitch button. So I need to fess up with something. I originally started stitching this in November, and I was going to use it as December's design for the One Stitch at a Time Club. And then I changed my mind and I decided I wanted to do a Santa for December. So I thought, well, I'll save this and do this in January. So I had it half stitched, put it aside, brought it back out, and as I'm stitching this and showing you how to do these stitches, I realized, oh yeah, I was going to do this one a little differently. And actually the stitching that I did way back in November, I used 3 strands of floss because I wanted it to look a bit chunkier. So I don't know if you can see the difference, but you know, it's something, it's not too noticeable. It's not noticeable enough that I'm going to take it out, but this way you can see too which way you want to go. This is with 2 strands. This is with 3 strands over there. So you can see there's a slight difference. The other thing that I changed out just now between takes, I realized, well, wait, I had this snow as blue and I want it to be white. And I took the snowflakes out that I had done too because I realized I want to make it look really chunky. So I'm going to use all 6 strands of my ecru floss to make it look nice and chunky, like they're standing in deep snow. So I'm going to do the snowflakes in that 6 strands also to really make them pop. They weren't really popping enough before. So the way you want to do the snowflake, they're just single stitches, but one thing I would recommend, since there's a fairly hefty knot, since it's 6 strands, don't start in the center because then every time you pull your thread through, you're going to be going through that knot. So start on one of the little outside edges of a snowflake. go in towards the center and pull it through. And form your snowflake that way. And that way you're not going to have to be fighting going through that. Now, one thing I did want to mention too is that I'm still using my size 7 needle, which actually is not big enough. I could go ahead and thread it, but what you want to look for, I didn't, since there wasn't a whole lot of stitching there. Ideally, you want the thread, once it's in the needle, to be the same width as the needle, so that you can see here, it's pretty evident on my eye anyway, I don't know if it is for you, but that the thread is thicker than the needle. So the needle isn't making a big enough hole to pull that through, so you really have to tug at it. So that's kind of how you judge the size of your needle. It's almost the same, but it could be just a little bit bigger of an eye, but it will work for these purposes. So I have a couple more snowflakes to do, and then this guy's going to be all finished up. I'll press him, and then I'll show you what it looks like all pressed. And when you press, you want to press it from the back side, and that way it allows the depth of these stitches to be absorbed into the soft ironing board surface, so that it doesn't flatten the stitches out. And I like to put a little spray starch on there too.